Well, good evening. We're going to get started for the benefit of those who are joining us via Zoom. Even as some of you find some food and water and literature and settle into your chairs. I'm Tim Christ, president of the Newark History Society. We're delighted that you're here tonight. There's a lot of interest in this topic, Thomas McCarter, Newark Trolleys, and building Newark Streetcar Suburbs. This is our 20th year of programming, all free and open to the public for the Newark History Society, and this gets us off to a really great start. I'll introduce our program in a moment, but first I want to ask Tom Ankner from the Newark Public Library to bring greetings, and then and Daniela Fonseca from NJPAC with a quick welcome as well, because they're co-sponsoring this program tonight. Tom?
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the library on behalf of the Board of Trustees and Interim Director Ingrid Bettencourt. We are proud to partner with the Newark History Society on this program, exploring the history of the trolley and streetcar system in and around Newark. Just a few housekeeping items for those of you who haven't been here before. The bathrooms are out in the store on the left. As Tim has said already, there's food over there that the Newark History Society is providing. Please help yourselves if you haven't already. We also ask that people here in Centennial Hall hold their questions until the end. There will be microphones going around after the presentation so that people can ask their questions then. People watching on Zoom can type their questions in the chat box or the Q&A box, and people on Facebook can type the questions in the comment box. We'll get to as many questions as possible after the program. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. If you have time after the presentation, you might want to visit an exhibit that just opened up upstairs called Made in Newark, which is linked to the 150th anniversary of the Newark Industrial Exhibition of 1872. It's up on the third floor gallery. This exhibit out here will be opening next week. So please enjoy your time at the library. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming on behalf of NJPAC. I want to thank Tim and the Newark Historical Society and the library for having us here and providing us with this beautiful and so interesting night that we have. We can learn about the history of Newark. I myself am very excited and I've been learning a lot. So thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Daniela. And Tom, I'm expecting to send out a notice to the Newark History Society list about the Made in Newark exhibit upstairs, and also the exhibit of Bill May's photographs. It's opening next week on this floor. We already have, I think, about 80 people joining by Zoom, so this is a real good crowd tonight. We have two speakers, Stephen Elliott and John Prieto. After which we will have a Q&A session. Steve will go first, followed by John. And we encourage those of you joining us via Zoom to write your questions into the chat or the Q&A. And Tom and I will try to manage the Q&A later. I'll be looking in the Zoom notes to see about those questions. But we'll do that after both presentations. So first, Stephen Elliott, who received his MA in history from Rutgers Newark and his PhD from Temple University. He's a part-time lecturer at Rutgers Newark, where he teaches the Newark course and Southern New Jersey history, as well as American military history. His book, on surviving the winters, housing Washington's army during the American Revolution was published a couple of years ago. So he has broad interest ranging from the American Revolution up to the early 20th century. So Steve, welcome. We're delighted that you're here.
Thank you, Tim. And thank you to everybody involved with putting on these Newark Historical Society events. As somebody who teaches Newark history multiple times a semester, having these lectures on YouTube and share these fantastic resource. And one that just keeps growing. So it's really exciting to be here tonight to talk to you all about my topic, building Newark streetcar suburbs. And I'll get into what exactly is a streetcar suburb in a few minutes. But essentially, I'll be discussing how most of Newark's residential neighborhoods came to be during this fairly brief period of time in the city's history, about 50 years, late 19th century, the early 20th century. And the image you see in the background there is a street scene of the Roseville section of Newark from probably the 1890s, 1900s. And Roseville's one of the major neighborhoods that we'll be discussing. There we go. So a quick background, map of Newark made in 1859, basically Newark in the 1860s. This is an image of the city when it's about 200 years old, 200 years of continuous habitation. And despite going through an immense industrial transformation in the early 19th century and rapid population growth approaching 100,000 people by 1860 or thereabouts, the spread of development in the city had not moved too far beyond the original pattern of Puritan settlement in the 1600s. Yes, you had some neighborhoods that had spilled across into what is now Down Neck here, and particularly German immigrants that moved up the hill, now Third Ward. But the vast majority of Newarkers still lived within about a half-hour walk from that hadn't changed much since days of Robert Treat. So long story short, Newark in 1860 was a walking city, the primary mode of transportation people get around within the city. Now, yes, if you think about the Lehigh Valley and Coal, railroads were moving from Newark to other cities, but intra-city travel within the city, remained by foot or horse carriage. Well, contrast that with a map of Newark from 1915, less than 50 years later, and we see that development had really spilled out across the entirety of the city's geography. This red outline here is roughly the area you saw on the previous map. By 1915, it had extended in pretty much every direction. So my talk tonight is basically going to be explaining why in this fairly short period of Newark's history, we went from this small pattern of development to this much broader pattern. And the areas I'll be speaking about mostly tonight are Roseville section, which is west of Branchville Park, up here on the map, Clinton Hill, southwest of downtown, here, and broadly the west side in general, pretty much this. And to really explain why this development occurred and its consequences for the city, we'll be looking at three related forces. These are things that historians that have looked at this phenomenon in other cities, Boston, Philadelphia, have identified as important. So that's what I'll be focusing on. Those are technology, particularly transportation technology, finance, and what I refer to as ideas. So basically, ideas and images about housing and residential neighborhoods, what they meant to people, and the motivations for people in actually purchasing houses during this time period. And as we will see, after 1870, technology, finance, and ideas kind of had a convergence that led to a rapid building boom in Newark. And so too, after 1920, changes in these same three areas in Newark's residential housing situation. So the first and most direct, and one that my colleague tonight, John, is going to talk about in more depth, is the transportation technology. So I'm going to touch on that briefly here, but it's not going to be my main focus. As I said earlier, Newark in the 1860s was primarily a walking city. During the 1860s and on into the 1870s, though, you had the advent of a new form of transportation technology in the city, and that was the horse-drawn streetcar. So essentially, these cars that are kind of similar to modern day buses that were pulled by horses at regular intervals along fixed lines throughout the city, enabled people to, for the first time, commute from one corner of the city to the other. And these streetcar lines moved out from downtown and up kind of hillier sections of the city as you moved west, and facilitated the settlement of the neighborhood we're talking about. Of course, horse-drawn streetcars have drawbacks. They're not fast, a lot of upkeep on keeping horses alive, created all sorts of pollution issues as well. So they were not ideal. And by the 1890s, the horse-drawn streetcar was replaced with the modern electric trolley. In the 1890s and early 1900s, which is the boom of trolley line expansion in Newark and pretty much every city in the United States. Most of your kind of famous Newark streets like Bloomfield Ave, Springfield Ave, Central Ave were during the 1890s and 1800s trolley lines. Trolleys going up to Montclair and up to Springfield and Vauxhall, et cetera, running again at regular intervals at fairly cheap rates. The 5-cent fare was considered sacred among trolley riders for getting around the city. So particularly in the 1890s, we see a rapid expansion of trolley lines. And with that would come residential development. So as these trolley lines moved down Springfield Ave, moved up Bloomfield Avenue, moved down Central or South Orange Ave, they moved out into areas that were pretty much just farmland, say the 60s or 70s. But the arrival of a cheap, reliable, usually means of transportation in the city, and that people could now move out from the central city to areas where land is cheaper, and they had more space, and that leads to the residential development of a lot of these areas. Hence the name Streetcar Suburbs. Commuter residential sections of the city, much like many of us commute today, but they didn't commute by cars, they commuted by cars. So that's the transportation technology side of this. A less straightforward aspect of this is finance. So anybody in the audience purchased a house or any kind of property knows that you need to deal with banks and mortgage companies, et cetera, to get the money for the house. Now, the banking situation in say, the 1870s or 1880s was a little bit different. And the primary means that a lot of the home buyers that we're talking about tonight used to purchase their houses was something called the Building and Loan Association. And these were essentially locally organized associations on, say, the city or even neighborhood level, in which people would pool their money together and usually acquire financing from somewhere higher up, like a bigger bank, and then use that money to purchase a plot of land and develop. So if you want to buy a house, you would hopefully apply for membership with your local B&L. They would take some of your money and put it into this pool, acquire a piece of property, hire architects, hire builders, and start to erect homes. It's viewed as ideally a way for the common man to buy into home ownership by these fraternal associations, putting all the money together. And you can see here a quote from a Newark Building Association that basically says as much. Association is formed for the purpose of providing all who become members of it with comfortable housing and genial surroundings. Awesome. So that was, again, how these associations advertised themselves. However, it was a little more complicated than just a bunch of happy workers putting together money to buy a house. They had all sorts of very complicated systems and arrangements between forming an association and home ownership. So in one case, a B&L acquired a piece of land. New members had to pay a kind of sign-on fee and then monthly dues. They would draw the names of members at random to actually have a house that would be built. So kind of win the lottery drawing that month, you'd be the person for B&L to get a house built for you that month. Once you moved in, the house was finished, you had to continue paying membership fees to the B&L. You did not actually get a title home ownership until the entire tract of land B&L had purchased was developed. So you need to continue having new members come in, pay dues, have a lottery drawing to get the house developed. If that might strike you as sounding like a little bit of a Ponzi scheme, we see here from another Newark B&L pamphlet at the bottom, it is to the advantage of all our stockholders to increase the business of the association by securing new members. So they pretty much said it on the face of it, that these things only work by bringing in more people and more capital to increase development. And even in kind of peak Gilded Age capitalism and corruption, there were folks in the government that recognized it as such. The lawsuit against Newark B&L here, with Vice Chancellor says, this association is one of those concerns got enough to make money out of poor persons. And my advice to shareholders is to get out as soon as possible. So there is, again, a sort of Ponzi scheme aspect to a lot of these B&Ls. Some were on the up and up, some were shadier than others. They suffered a bit during the Panic of 1893, but then had a rebound in the early 1900s. After 1900, we also see more traditional real estate companies and firms that sort of thing take charge of development. But the B&Ls remained in existence and an important force in home development all the way up through the 1900s. Kind of come to their demise and this was another thing that was kind of all around the U.S., but New Jersey had the third highest number of B&Ls around 1900 in the U.S., particularly prevalent here in Ohio. So last but not least, we've got our transportation technology, we've got our financing. We need to understand what exactly people wanted in their houses and in their residential neighborhoods. What was the idea or ideology of the home? For that, I've got this really long quote from a historian named Richard White, who wrote a history of the Gilded Age a few years ago. And in it, he talks about how the home was central to 19th century America. Essentially, what we might call the American dream in, say, the 1870s or 1880s, rested on the idea of home ownership. American leaders, politicians, ideologues, etc., believed that in an industrializing society, in a country where you had thousands of people working as factory hands and hired farm labor, for America to be successful, that kind of status had to be temporary. The idea was that people would work in a factory or work on a farm long enough and hard enough that they would accumulate enough money that they could buy a house. So a house was essentially the symbol of having made it, having become successful, having become independent. We're no longer just a factory worker. You earned enough to own a house. So in a country that was undergoing a lot of technological and economic change, the home was seen as a symbol of stability, success. There's a gendered element to it as well. With women largely confined to the domestic sphere in the 19th century. So having a home kind of gave a place for women in society. So around the U.S., from cities to small towns, home ownership was considered vital to help the public. And very much the style of home was supposed to be almost like today, a detached single family home. Yards and not quite as big as they are now, obviously there's no need for a driveway. But this was considered the idea. And this is actually a photograph of a Newark cottage taken in the early 1900s. It's used as an example of what you want. So that's what was believed around the country. What do we know about what Newarkers specifically felt about it? Well, we know the kind of businessmen that had a lot of power in 19th century Newark wanted good houses for their workers. You can see two quotes here from the Newark Board of Trade, which was kind of a precursor to the Newark Commerce Association. So they say, wide extent of territory within our corporate limits give us ample facilities for building small houses for workers. 1883, again, they want best model homes for our artisans, again, our workers, patterned after those of Philadelphia or better. You'll see the architecture actually quite different from that. From kind of the bottom up perspective of people living in Newark looking for housing, we've got a quote here from a boarding house resident, so somebody that's just renting a room in the center of the city. And he states, there is something grander, more noble, more elevating in life than you can find in Mrs. Landinger's boarding house. So he feels that just living in a sorry about that, and sorry, Zoom, but that's much better. So as you can see in this quote here, person living in a single room in a boarding house is looking for more out of life. And in fact, his neighbor, a guy named Edward Duffield, a 23-year-old Princeton graduate that had just moved to Newark in the 1890s, writes to his future wife, "My highest ambition now is to secure a parlor and a bedroom that I can call my own." Because people living in these flats and rented rooms looking for something more, that idea of getting a house being a symbol of data. And then there's another side to this, which is that a lot of this streetcar suburb development is going on in the 1880s, 1890s, at the same time that the US is going through the process of closing the frontier. And there's this sort of parallel that developing the outskirts of the city is this sort of taming the wilderness and claiming man's mastery over nature. And we see that in History of Newark, written in 1913, talking about some of these residential developments. I mean, wilderness has, in a short time, changed one of the most beautiful residential sections of the city, taming the wilderness on the outskirts. We see lots of images of housing in particularly early 20th century advertisements. See here the houses that have made Clinton Hill famous. I guess another neighborhood I'll be talking about. I haven't found as many sources to tell us how women felt about this housing development in particular, but I did find an ad in the Ladies' Home Journal for a residential development here. Simply that was being targeted towards women, so they're interested in this. So those are what we might call the positive motivations for moving to the new residential sections of Newark. But there are other ones that are probably less positive. Important to remember that Newark in the late 19th century is increasingly ethnically diverse. This is a map of the kind of ethnic geography of Newark around 1880. Native born, Anglo or Yankee, if you will, in green, Irish in blue, and German red. And a lot of scholars that have studied these streetcar suburbs have argued that their development was in part driven by a desire, particularly the native born, to get away from these immigrant neighborhoods and kind of create more homogeneous, more waspy, for lack of a better term, neighborhoods on the outskirts of the city. And in fact, we will see that Roseville, beyond this scene of development, Clinton Hill is off the map. And initially, at least, a lot of people moving to those areas are going to be white, native born descendants. And lastly, there's a health and environmental aspect. It's a map of where all the factories in Newark were in 1910 or thereabouts. You can see again, concentrated in the city center. So people moving out to Clinton Hill down here, or Roseville up here, are in theory going to have a much healthier environment where we have smokestacks of the industrial city. This map on the left here tells us a lot about ethnic diversity. we don't have as many good records to tell us about how people moving to these residential suburbs felt about race. Newark has a very small but present Black population in the late 19th century. I was able to find one petition to the city government from 1891 by a Black resident that mentions the fact that it's very difficult for a Black person to get a decent house in a decent section of the city. So unsurprisingly, it seems that race was a factor in that as well. So again, we bring together a streetcar line, a building loan association, a population that for a variety of reasons wants to move to a new residential section. And in the 1880s, we get Roseville. So Roseville lay west of the developed part of the city. Streetcar lines arrived in the 1870s. Time it was still mostly farmland and estates. These were quickly purchased by D&Ls, carved up into residential sections and built up as housing. And there's a few quotes on here that give us some different perspectives on Roseville. So one reminiscing resident from a few decades later called Roseville Newark's northwestern frontier. So again, that frontier parallel, that idea of mastery over nature. We've got some great quotes from the Roseville Improvement Association. It was a sort of homeowners association formed in the 1880s. There's kind of a resolution they passed complaining about the city's kind of tendency to look the other way when it came to improving new saloons and drinking on Sundays, which was very tied up in ethnic politics. Sort of native-born Puritan offshoot folks did not like Sunday drinking. The Germans were a big fan of it. So this tells us that the folks moving to Roseville, at least initially, were trying to create sort of white Anglo-Saxon native-born enclave, not trying to have diversity and integration. They're also kind of focused like it, or act like a modern-day homeowners association. So there's all sorts of resolves about trimming your bushes and making your house appear nice. Again, to improve your property values, very important, very heavily leveraged analysis. 1909, there's a booklet published called Newark as a Residential City, which was very glowing in its praise of Roseville. People are among the most refined, cultured, and progressive in the city. Again, this was sort of a real estate ad, so of course that makes sense. So Roseville kind of functions as our initial foray into streetcar suburbs. Next on the list would be Clinton Hill, which develops a little bit later. This was a separate township until the 1890s when Newark annexed it. But rapidly thereafter, a streetcar line comes in on Clinton Avenue. Building loan associations are set up, and development proceeds. From very early on and kind of coming into the fold in Newark, the residents of Clinton Hill envisioned it as kind of a streetcar suburb in the making. They even actively mentioned that they were trying to equal Roseville. So they saw the success of Roseville north of them, and they wanted to do the same. And we again see in some of the promotional literature today, it's a convenient locality of Newark businessmen. So in kind of commuter suburb for people working in the city center. And we get an idea of what motivated these folks to move there. Desires of the people to get out of the city and onto the hill where there was good air and a delightful semi-suburban life, which I thought was a really interesting term that kind of encapsulates these neighborhoods that are still part of the city. They're part of Newark. But if you look at the housing, again, oftentimes either a detached home or a single family, or in some cases, two-family homes, where you have somebody who would own a house and then rent out the upstairs to kind of pay off the mortgage, and tree-lined streets, so the trolley going up the street there, and eventually high schools and other kind of bigger buildings as well. This is what's taking shape in Clinton Hill. Clinton Hill stands out in the early 1900s because rather than building and loan associations, a larger realty company takes charge in its development, led by a guy named Louis Schlesinger, one of the sort of real estate moguls of early 19th century Newark, the one who built up the city. Some other sources for anybody out in Zoom land that might be a graduate student interested in doing more research on this phenomenon. The city has in the city archives the building records of the Office of the Superintendent of Buildings. So there's hundreds of these folded up sheets which tell us the name of a person that was owned a lot where a house was going to be built, the date in which its construction was going to be approved, the address of the house, whether it was made from brick or wood, whether it was a dwelling, a factory, or a commercial building, and some other information as well. We have these for decades, from the 1880s through the 1920s. You compare that with the Sanborn fire insurance maps, which are some of you familiar with, which literally mapped out every single street in the city with an outline of what kind of structure was there, and again, what it was made out of, wood or brick. So if someone wanted to, and had an army of undergrads and research assistants, they could plug all of this data into a spreadsheet. They could double check it with Sanborn maps, and you could create a almost day by day living map of how the work developed during the hundreds. Anybody out there, Rutgers wants to fund that or get behind that, that would be really interesting to see. So actually jumping back to this for a second, we only go by these realty ads, the newspapers, and the brochures. One would think Newark was largely a city of these very fine detached single-family homes. But if we dig into the superintendent of building records, we'll see that the vast majority of the houses listed in these columns are 3 stories. They're on very narrow lots and usually made of wood, frame houses. And that's where we get Newark's working class house, which winds up being the sort of dominant housing type of the city. If you drive through Newark's neighborhoods today, you've probably seen a few houses crammed in there that look like this. This home was known as the 3-decker, 3 floors. These houses were, again, much more rudimentary, not as well built. Typically have 6 families crammed into them, so one on either side of a central stairway. They're essentially Newark's tenements. So this is where your working class, your new immigrants would have found themselves when they moved to the city. And they're not advertised. Again, you don't see these in the realty sections of the newspaper. Occasionally, you'll see a line way at the bottom of the page saying, you know, somebody's been hired to build a 3-story house. It seems that whenever a building and loan association failed, whenever there was a little lot somewhere in the city that wasn't developed, smaller builders, oftentimes immigrants, Germans and Irish by the 1890s, 1900s, that have become established and had some money, would swoop in and build these houses wherever they could, and then rent them out to newer immigrants, Italians, Eastern Europeans, etc. So we really get a sort of 2-sided story to Newark's housing. These sort of fancy middle class trolley suburbs, and then mixed in these working class 3-decker neighborhoods. And people in the 19th century in Newark and around the US were very against these. So you can see here quotes from a housing study that the city government commissions in 1913, writing that as soon as they arrive in a district, they will spoil its beauty, safety, and hurt the land values. So there was actually a 3-decker panic around the United States in the early 1900s. Again, very prominent in Newark and the surrounding area. From a magazine called The Building Age that mentions that 64% of tenement houses erected in Essex County were of this style in the early 1900s. So we wind up with a Newark that, again, has these very large, fancy houses. That's got more middle-class residents, 2-family homes, and in this striking picture, whole districts of these 3-story tenements going up. And you can see that in the background here, there's still empty land, very freshly developed. So what happens? The sort of rapid and unregulated building that occurs all the way up through the early 1900s eventually leads to a pushback from the government, both city and state, during the early 20th century, which coincides with the progressive era, which witnesses a lot of regulation and attempts to regulate things. So we get the tenement law, which is passed by the state government in 1904, which is supposed to crack down on things like the three-decker. The tenement committee that was created was not well funded, so basically a bunch of people get cited for violations and told not to build houses like that anymore, and they get brushed off. The city government commissions this housing study between 1911 and 1913, which you can find online for free. And that was kind of how I got started doing this research, was by pouring through that study. And they take a bunch of pictures and write a bunch of reports about what makes a good house and what makes a poor house. The original photographs are in storage in the city archives. Recent pictures, backgrounds, my slide. And eventually, Newark creates its first comprehensive master plan in 1915 that draws on kind of the information provided by the housing study. And that effectively enshrines the single family home as the ideal housing type in Newark moving forward. You can see here, building code should forbid the construction of three-story frame houses. So if the people running Newark got their way, beginning of the 1920s, Newark would only really have two-family or single-family homes forward, which is a problem when the city has sort of run out of geographic space on which to build, and when its population is still rapidly growing. That's the consequence of that. In the 1920s, and especially from 1930 beyond, Newark streetcar suburbs and really around the country witness a decline that's brought about by changes in those three factors I started at. So technologically, the trolley, which is king of transportation in the 1890s and 1900s, is superseded by the automobile. And automobile-dependent suburbs are really built outside of Newark, where there's still fresh land to develop. So while Newark itself has a population that grows a few percent between 1920 and 1930, places like Maplewood witnessed 300% growth in the 1920s. Because again, people are moving out of the city, much for the same reasons they would have moved to Roseville or Clinton Hill a few decades earlier, but in Maplewood, they can get a garage and a parking spot for the Model T or whatever drive. So technology conspires against the streetcar suburb. Finance. The Great Depression starts in 1929, really wipes out the building and loan association. Catastrophic for these small local lending organizations. And in their stead, as kind of a part of the government's bailout during the New Deal, the Homeowners Loan Corporation was created, HOLC. The HOLC is, of course, infamous for creating these redlining maps, like the one that you see on my slide here, where essentially you had these federally hired real estate folks that would go out and deliver reports on what neighborhoods were good or bad to invest in. And almost always the hazardous neighborhoods, the ones outlined in red, were places where African Americans or immigrants lived. And a good chunk of Newark's downtown, including parts of Clinton Hill, were redlined in the 1930s. Pretty much the entire rest of the city was yellow line. One step up would be red line. We can see here a quote from one of these HOLC reports on the Roseville section, where it says foreclosures have been very heavy, chiefly by the P&Ls. So see that financial impact there. And it was inhabited by Italians. Even though they're the better grade, it still got it a yellow ranking. In fact, the only part of Newark that got a blue ranking was the Weequahic section. It was one of the last to be developed and was actually on a kind of modern suburban model. So fully detached houses, plenty of parking. So very similar to places like Maplewood, Livingston. And then finally, the ideal of the house and kind of what motivated people to move. Well, folks still wanted to own a house and have their leafy life in the suburbs, but of course that was now found outside of Newark's boundaries entirely. Also, a lot of these areas that had been kind of white native-born enclaves in the 1890s had witnessed an influx of immigrants. So Roseville goes from being WASP to Irish, eventually Italian. Clinton Hill witnesses an influx of middle-class students in the 30s and 40s. So by 1960, Newark City government doing a report on its neighborhoods. It mentions how Clinton Hill was once a prestige area of one-family homes, but now it's being carved up into apartments, and there's an underlying sort of racist overtone. Black folks are moving into this neighborhood, so it's no longer desirable. And pretty much from the Great Depression onwards, there was not much residential construction in Newark. Most of the residences that go up were federally funded affordable housing projects in massive urban renewal developments, mostly in the red line areas, the old central section of the city. And it would seem that that would bring the story of Newark residences in the streetcar suburbs to a close. There is one postscript to the story, though. Beginning in the 1990s and on into the 2000s, Newark witnessed another building boom of housing, a lot of times in the same neighborhoods I talked about earlier. And the style of house, many of you might be familiar with, is the Bayonne box, which is still kind of the dominant housing type in New York today. Much like the streetcar suburbs of yesteryear, motivations for the Bayonne box were similar. People wanted home ownership. Many times the Bayonne box included a flat that was rented out to help pay for the home. Transportation is obviously not trolleys, but cars. So Bayonne box is a very prominent parking spot and garage. And much like the streetcar suburbs, Bayonne boxes had all sorts of shady financial aspects to them, and many of them were foreclosed upon after the 2008 crash. And lastly, they witnessed their own sort of government crackdown on what a good house they were supposed to look like. Mayor Booker commissioned Beyond the Box report in 2009 with this quote here talking about why those houses were bad, which has lots of echoes to the 1911 housing. Today, a lot of these Bayonne boxes actually stand next to three-deckers and trolley houses in places like Hill and Roseville. The last decade or so has mostly seen residential development in the form of apartments downtown. So we don't know what the next chapter of Roseville will look like. But I think given all the talk about gentrification and development in the city today, it's important that we look back on its sort of residential story. My talk.
So we'll hold questions for Steve until after John's presentation. John Prieto serves as both archivist and member of the board of the Canal Society of New Jersey, and many of you will remember his presentation to the Newark History Society about the Morris Canal. He is a graduate of NJIT and worked for many years at the New Jersey Board of Utilities here in Newark. John? Welcome.
Good evening. I wanted to personally thank Tim, the Newark Public Library, and NJPAC. So we'll be shifting the discussion to trolleys, Mr. McCarter, and his company you may have heard of, Public Service. So in 1900, Newark was a city on the move. Industry and business were flourishing. Population was about 250,000. But the infrastructure tried to keep up. And the intersection of road and markets was known as the busiest in the nation. On the day after New Year's, 1903, new mayor Henry Meade Doremus, he addressed the city. He had praise for the city's new library and improved streets and called for more to be done about contagious diseases and the police and fire departments. Mr. Doremus also issued a warning. The city's railroad grade crossings would have to be eliminated, or children on their way to school would be in danger. His words were eerily prophetic. On the morning of February 19th, 1903, a trolley traveling along Clifton Avenue and carrying children on their way to school collided with a speeding train, resulting in the deaths of 9 and injuries to 30 others. Due to the icy tracks, which had not been sanded, the brakes would not work. It was reported later that the children's school was, quote, transformed into a house of mourning. New Jersey's young Attorney General, Thomas McCarter, stated that the accident could have been avoided had operations and equipment been standardized. There's Mr. McCarter, a young version. The trolley companies had been in decline for some time. There had been several major trolley accidents in recent years, and the demand for better transportation services became stronger. So a change was needed. Indeed, a change was already underway. Only 2 weeks after the fatal collision, a proposal was made to consolidate the Northern New Jersey trolley companies, and there were many of them. Meanwhile, plans were being made by Fidelity Trust of Newark for a more ambitious merger, one that would include the electric and gas companies as well. The influential subcommittee established to promote this consolidation had as a member Thomas McCarter, who happened to be the Attorney General and had bank and utility backing, as well as that from United States Senator John Dryden, who happened to be president of Prudential Insurance. Fidelity Trust president was Uzal McCarter, who happened to be Thomas's brother. In only a few weeks' time, the Fidelity Trust plan was approved. With the formation of the new Public Service Corporation, McCarter was selected as its president. So in many ways, he was well suited for the position. Years later, McCarter would say this about the formation of public service. The traction lines, in my opinion, were overcapitalized, and it soon became a matter of common knowledge that they were short of money. I conceived the scheme that the way to remedy the situation was to put all the utilities of the state that could be induced to join into one corporation under one management, so that the strong would carry the weak. So Thomas Nesbitt McCarter was born in Newark in 1867. He was the son of the elder Thomas McCarter, who was an esteemed member of the New Jersey Bar and had a lucrative law practice. Junior McCarter's brothers, Robert and Uzal, were born in Newton, from where their father took the family to Newark in 1865. The younger McCarter was well educated. He attended Newark Academy, Pingree School, Princeton, and Columbia Law School. It was in his father's offices in the early 1890s that Junior McCarter began his study of the law. Over the next few years, he got involved with the Lehigh Valley Railroad and did a survey of the Morris Canal. This is where they lived in the old Ninth Ward, Broad Street of Franklin. You can see the name on the map. In 1896, New Jersey Governor Griggs appointed the younger McCarter judge of the first district of the court in Newark. In 1899, he resigned and was subsequently elected to the New Jersey State Senate, where he sharpened his political skills. He then became chairman of the Republican State Committee. He helped Governor Murphy get elected. And he was a factor in getting John Dryden elected to U.S. Senator. In 1902, McCarter himself became general counsel of Fidelity Trust. And thereafter, New Jersey Governor Murphy appointed him as Attorney General. By May 1903, with experience in law and a longtime interest in transportation, McCarter by now had acquired valuable knowledge of banking, finance, mergers, politics, and the ability to think big. He also possessed one other key asset: powerful connections. Before 1903 was out, McCarter had his first test as president. There was trouble with the trolleys. Too few cars, too many in poor condition, soon led to a public outcry. A strike by the trolley workers over wages became violent, but was soon put down by the company. McCarter took out an ad in a local paper to apologize. The company's poor performance, he said, was due to the miserable trolley cars that we inherited. New trolleys were on order, and he asked for patience. But he ended the ad with a sting. Unreasonable and vexatious ordinances and impositions can only result in additional delay in the efforts of our company to improve its system, and will, of course, be contested if they enact. His fiery words would soon set the tone for the remainder of his tenure, and the trolleys would haunt him again. McCarter had a reputation of being a combative individual. He was described as being a bully and pugnacious. A news article in 1902 stated that because of McCarter's personality, he, quote, frequently made an unnecessary enemy. His hubris and intimidating tactics were often on display and were far-reaching. Magazine. Okay, so within his first years of being company president, McCarter had a new home built in Lincoln Park, number 59 in the old Third Ward. The neighborhood was home to other Newark industrialists as well, but he didn't stay very long. By 1905, he had left the city and moved to an estate in Rumson, where the sprawling grounds offered him gardens and spectacular views. Years later, in a speech celebrating the Newark Centennial, he would lament his exodus from the city, but acknowledge people's push for the suburbs. That's how it looks more recently. The turn of the century had witnessed the growth of big business, finance, and even utility consolidation. Smaller companies struggled and were being taken over by larger ones. There really was no financial watchdog in place. That's the big four. You can see some of the names you recognize already. In 1906, Newark corporate giants Prudential, Fidelity, and Public Service, and the Union Bank found themselves the target of investigation. The hearings highlighted a new and potentially troubling trend. Corporations were tied together with corporate heads serving on each other's board of directors, highlighting a future examination of what came to be known interlocking directorships. Fidelity Trust funded the formation of Public Service. McCarter helped Dryden get elected. Prudential lent Public Service big money, and the current state of affairs had put the focus on a new phenomenon, the holding company, with all its subsidiaries. This arrangement began in the late 1890s when Governor Voorhees changed the laws to favor corporations. McCarter was among those who led the charge. So the consolidation of the gas companies was soon followed by the consolidation of the trolley companies. And public service itself became a holding company. But while these activities were not necessarily illegal, they were looked upon as suspicious. Some holding companies started charging subsidiaries high fees to improve their position. This action would later lead to the FTC, SEC, and the Public Utility Holding Company Act of 1935. Later on, McCarter would be compelled to testify, but he always insisted that public service is stocked with, quote, hot water. We might say diluted. By 1911, concerned with the troubling corporate landscape, New Jersey created the Board of Public Utility Commissioners. Among its champions was Woodrow Wilson, with whom McCarter would often do battle. McCarter said the utility regulation law was, quote, crudely drawn, while Wilson thought that McCarter was, quote, ignorant. McCarter once said, the claim is made that we are active in politics. He went on to say, we have been to the extent of self-preservation. The Public Utility Commissioner office could perform no better work than to helping take the corporation out of politics. Well, the full order. While he eventually acknowledged the usefulness of the PUC, he often questioned its motives. And he would later characterize the board as, quote, a pack of political horse thieves. Here's a quote from the day. Politics often mixed with business. Carter once said that after he became president that he was done with politics. But politics never left him. He fought hard for the company, and he was adept at what they call political horse trading. Some examples were the promise of better suburban trolley service to Dalesburg in exchange for annexation, or the return of the 5-cent fare in exchange for allowing public service to form a coordinated transportation company. At one point, he was even rumored to be a candidate for U.S. Senate. His influence over matters affecting the business remained strong, and the family seemed to be all powerful. When he resigned as Attorney General to head public service, his brother Robert was appointed Attorney General. And when none other than U.S. Supreme Court Justice William Brennan was once interviewed about living in Newark in his early days, he was quoted as saying, they ran the state. They had a grip on the Newark Police Department, and a strike was once defeated because the police were on the side of the McCarters. So despite the company's troubles, it managed to find a new headquarters on the corner of Broad and Bank, which had replaced their widely scattered offices. It was as impressive as it was imposing. Public service had actually leased the building from Centennial. It was described as being almost palatial. So this is Broad Market around 1912. In the meantime, traffic in Newark had become intolerable. Streets were packed with commuters, all manner of vehicles. Broad Market was known as the Four Corners, the busiest intersection in America. City planners were up in arms to find solutions. So McCarter himself floated the idea of using the Morris Canal and abandoning the old Central Market to help with the congestion. And he pushed for a subway and railroad connection. The idea of easing traffic flow was discussed as early as 1904, but by now help was on its way. McCarter had approached the Newark City Plan Commission to propose his new idea for addressing the gridlock. His idea was a new terminal building that would handle the flow of trolleys and also house public services' new headquarters. The City Commission gave its blessing for the adoption in 1913, It was located near Military Park, cost about $5 million, and had multiple levels for trolleys. It even had shops open to the public. It was felt that the terminal would be not the final solution, but a first step in better rapid transit in Newark. And give rise to the idea that, quote, not all good transportation terminates or originates at the four corners. There's Mr. McCarter on the job. The terminal proved to be a success. Traffic counts at Broader Market were about half of what they were only a few years earlier. There it is under construction. The final product. It was finished in 1916, I believe. The Broader Market got a little better. So by this time, the PS had indeed been investing in improvements, and its financial position was sound. McCarter enhanced the company's publicity department and said the company was experiencing, quote, marvelous efficiency and loyalty. And he was as busy as ever. He became president of the American Railway Association, later the Edison Electric Institute, and was an influential leader in the industry. He even took a nationwide tour, ostensibly to develop better customer relations. He gave speeches and wrote commentary, and he was constantly fighting the anti-corporate agenda that the politicians were bringing up. By 1917, the country had entered the war, and businesses needed to adjust accordingly. He put the company on its own war footing, taking out newspaper ads to discuss the company's wartime actions and declaring that the employees must, quote, hew to the line of the closest economy. The more article. He even put together a book of all his speeches. And in 1918, public services rail workers struck for better wages. McCarter would not deal directly with the Utility Commission ruled that public service would only be given a 6-cent fare allowance. Then began hearings on a proposed zone fare system. With an 11th hour request, public service asked that the fares be raised to 7 cents. A hearing in March of 1919 in Newark, the assembled crowd of town officials was unruly. Newark's mayor said of the company, somehow or other, this gang of pirates has been able to control the courts and everything else. The people just can't let this gang of robbers get away with it any longer. And the second hearing in October, Montclair's mayor declared that the people will not patronize public service railway until they are, quote, treated as a decent human being. And in Camden, the solicitor said public service, quote, has not the goodwill of the public. Some years earlier, Truth magazine had reported that it hoped public service would realize what a New York railroad official once said: a railroad's poorest asset was a dissatisfied constituent. The matter was ultimately settled when a war labor mediator brokered terms that were finally acceptable to both the company and the workers. McCarter tried to spin the settlement as a clear victory for public service. He also wanted to make sure that any wage increase would be met with, quote, a compensating increase in revenue. He would continue to seek higher fares at every turn. A League of Municipality official said that instead of molasses, quote, public service has been accustomed to using vinegar. By the 1920s, Newark's population was increasing and its downtown was again humming with pedestrians, buildings, and again, all manner of vehicles. Unfortunately for McCarter, the festering issues of rail fares and worker peace would soon return. So the first horse trolley, Steve may mention, appeared somewhere around the 1860s in Newark. The first electric street railway in Newark appeared about 1890. In the cities, transportation was becoming big business. After the consolidation, public services trolleys really held sway. Then in 1914, competition appeared. The new mode of transportation was called the jitney. In 1915, streetcar companies tried to have the jitney buses regulated. But the buses were popular. They had lower fares, they could move around obstacles, and over the next few years, their ridership increased dramatically. McCarter was strongly opposed to their use, calling it this jitney evil and, quote, a fly-by-night business. In 1920, he filed complaints against 36 jitney operators. The suits were all ultimately rejected. But the trolleys were losing out to the jitneys. With no rate relief, McCarter said the company could not afford trolley worker raises. So in 1921, he proposed a wage cut and later sought more increases. With pushback from the Utility Commission, in 1923, he again called for pay cuts, and the trolley workers struck again. McCarter dug in. He took out an ad saying the company would raise wages only if the Public Utility Commission would approve fares based on higher company assets evaluation. Then offered a final raise, which was rejected. Of the strikers, McCarter said, quote, if they only knew the economical and financial distress of the company, they would not be so selfish and heedless of their own welfare as to seek to force the company to pay higher wages. We see traffic was building again. With no action on his proposal, McCarter decided to stop running the trolleys altogether. To pick up the slack, the jitneys went to work, but they struggled. The strike lasted 52 days and was devastating for all parties. The strike finally was settled when McCarter capitulated to a threat of forced receivership, and the rail workers were ordered back to work by the court. In the end, the workers got a 10 to 20% pay increase, and the company got a modified transfer of fare system put in place. When the smoke cleared, McCarter was handed a rare defeat. The strike resolution demonstrated that a higher power existed. It also showed that McCarter had failed to understand the role that buses would play, and as well as the later effects of the suburban driver. As one city commissioner later said, quote, many citizens have moved to the suburbs and their home interests are there. McCarter soon came to his senses. Public service began to buy up the jitney operators and independent carriers and converted rail lines to bus lines, creating a virtual monopoly in the process. But by 1926, McCarter was horse trading again, asking that the trolley and bus operators take a 15% wage cut if the company was forced to keep the nickel fare, which he wanted. By the late 20s, the company would merge and renew further. Besides mergers with other utilities, the company merged its gas and electric utilities. It also formed, finally, Public Service Coordinated Transport, an idea for which McCarter had long called public. In 1928, McCarter and his brother Uzel formed the new Fidelity Union Stock and Bonds Company, underwriting and selling utilities. He was a busy man. McCarter's take on government regulation. John McCarter would also soon have a new enemy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whom he criticized for publicly funding by the federal government the overreach of electric power. The company's gross and operating revenues increased significantly in this first 2 decades. And public stock ownership increased sixfold. Along with many requests for rate increases, McCarter from time to time also petitioned for rate reduction. The company implemented a policy of paying life insurance, sick benefits, and pensions to employees and their beneficiaries, and also improved appliance offerings to the public. Although long removed by now from Newark, McCarter continued to be involved with the city. He was an investment property owner in the late 20s. He sat on the board of trustees at my alma mater, NJIT, previously known as NCE, and gave the school's commencement speech in 1931. He was involved with the planning of the new Pennsylvania station. In 1947, he was on the Citizens Advisory Committee for Newark's Central Planning Board, which looked to widen and improve city streets. So he was giving back. He was president of public service until 1939, when he became chairman of the board. He stayed on until the mid-40s. He passed away in 1955. It was right around this time that the last of Newark's streetcars were taken out of service, finally giving way to the buses. In 1978, public service would reestablish its presence in Newark, where it built its new headquarters. In his position as president, McCarter was a fierce protector of public service. Perhaps one of his earlier quotes best described his outlook. The success of the state, he said, depends on the expansion of public service. So it has been written that before the existence of public service, New Jersey cities were underserved by small utilities, using old equipment, having poor service, and having high rates. So McCarter's methods were more Wall Street than Main Street. And although he was at times crude, divisive, and questionable, his actions delivered results. After consolidation, it could be argued that quality, price, and continuity of service were superior to what was available before.
So if there are any questions in the audience here, now's a good time. John, I just might ask you, what was the peak year? Did you were you able to find ridership statistics and when was the peak for ridership? Somewhere in the 20s for that? John, if you could come up here and see if questions come in, I'll be checking Zoom for questions. And
We mentioned Galesburg, and then of course it went into other towns, Bloomfield. Public service wanted to annex a lot of these towns so they could run their trolleys out there. So I think at one point they did get to Galesburg.
Yeah, so from what I've seen, Orange Avenue, mainly east-west, how they start now. And you wind up with this situation where, development starts on kind of Orange and Roseville, and developers start to push development further north. And I found a newspaper article from the late 1890s where people, presumably in North Roseville, were now complaining that they didn't have good trolley service, so they wanted another line kind of cutting through Branchbrook Park and the north end of Roseville added. The town got started because of the trolley, but it grew too big for the trolley line that it had. But the main one was on Orange.
First, a question from Zoomland, and then we'll go there. Miles Zhang, who many of us know, who's a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan, asked Steve, were there race-based restrictive covenants in neighborhoods built by the B&L associations? In addition to blacks, were Italians, Irish, and other ethnic whites also excluded from this development?
Thanks, Miles. And there's not a ton of great primary source material I've been able to find on the building and loan associations beyond kind of mentions in newspapers, and the State Bureau of Labor Statistics actually did an annual report on them, but none of those organizations were really looking for things like racism or that sort of discrimination in the lending. So my best guess now is yes, there probably was, just what I know about 19th century America, but I don't have a kind of smoking gun primary source on that yet. But it is something I want to look into.
Hello, Bob Newhouse. I'm actually not from New Jersey. I'm from New York, Brooklyn, but great set of presentations. I have two questions. One is, you mentioned the public service terminal that opened in 1916 with the connecting subway. I know very little about that. How long did it last, and why was it pulled down? The second question is, it sounds like the plans for the city subway go back to the teens. Why did it take so long? I guess it opened, when did it actually open, and why did it take so long to get it?
Second question first. I believe the city subway opened around 1935. And I saw plans online that were from the 20s, but the ideas were culminating way before that. Why it took so long, I haven't seen why, except maybe for just red tape. Carter may have had something to do with that. The other subway lines you were talking about, I think Cedar Avenue was one of them that ran. So they built them I believe in the 20s or early 20s. Why they went silent, I don't know. The terminal was not supposed to be the end solution. It was supposed to be just carry them on for a little while. So I guess they started to abandon some of these lines before that. And I think some of them lay dormant for years. They were just covered over.
We're going one comment, John from Steve about that accident that when the train hit the trolley with 8 Behringer students. Behringer High School has a plaque dedicated to the event. There's also a stained glass window in the school that called the accident.
So what was the relationship between the existing subway that goes through Rancho Park and the trolley system, and why did one survive and the other no?
That's an interesting question. I don't know that I can give you a good answer. The old city subway just took over the old canal ditch. I think McCarter again tried to bring about ideas to interconnect other lines and other stations, but they didn't get very far. So that I can't answer the rest of that.
Going to jump in with another one from Miles Zhang, noting that in the 1870s, that Boss Tweed, Tammany Hall, New York City, politicians were accused of routing trolley lines, Steve, and elevated subways on paths that would serve their own business interests and lands owned by the same B&L associations they managed. Was there this kind of collusion in Newark too, with public service or before public service was formed? I noticed on the Sanborn map that major streets, nearly every major street had a trolley line, and the interior ones didn't.
Again, this is things I'm trying to delve a little deeper into as I move into the research. I know in other cities, the company is running these trolley lines into essentially empty countryside. Also had subsidiaries or cousins and whatnot, like I saw in John's presentation, that bought up that property and then started to market it. From just a little bit I've seen of the B&Ls in Newark, it seems like they were mostly smaller concerns. So I don't know how close of ties they had directly with, say, trolley companies to kind of done that. But it's like it was in other cities. I would imagine there was some of that as well.
Hi, Don Wallace. I've worked and lived around Newark all my life. Just an interesting addendum to the trolley in the suburban store. The earliest electric distribution for these neighborhoods was to tap into the trolley lines as long as you are off, which is a big transition because most of them that don't use gas light. And there was a question about the differential bar. That was a residual trolley line that was run up in connection with the WPA project. I don't know all the other details. I worked for the company about 30 years, so I picked up a few points.
Forgive me for not standing. I'm sure we've all heard about General Motors conspiring to do away with trolleys. Was that so in Newark? And how true is it really? Is it a myth?
I read up on that, and there was a fellow who wrote an article that talked about the link between General Motors getting rid of the trolleys, pushing the jitneys. So I think that had some connection to Newark. What exactly, I don't know, but I did read something about that. So there may be some truth to that.
Well, when did ESG sell their bus company to the state?
I believe it was 1971. So it became a TNJ, which was a state entity. And then by, I think, 79, it turned into New Jersey Transit, which you see today.
John, I'm going to put you on the spot with another one. Dan O'Flaherty, who's one of our original members of the society and knows a great deal about city commission government and such in this period. Thanks you for talking about round one and the jitney wars in the teens. And he asked, are you really sure McCarter entirely lost? Mayor Raymond supported jitneys, and McCarter joined with Nugent to promote charter change, and the commission formed a government in order to force Raymond out. Mayor Raymond was mayor in 1960. McCarter got the commission formed, but he didn't force Raymond out. Did he do better with the commission than he formed a government than he had with the older man form Newark city government in trying to get his way.
Can't really speak to that too much. As far as the strike is concerned, yes, I think that got the better of McCarter, but make no mistake, he wound up on top in just about everything he did. And he was very influential with the city government. So I would kind of agree with that. It may have been he may have lost the battle, but I think he won the war.
One more from Zoom, and then I think we're ready to say thank you. David Trainer notes that the 1923 strike involved the imposition of one-man cars with a predictable reaction from labor. Did you see that?
Briefly, not enough to really get into it, but that issue did come up. Yeah.
Great. Well, why don't we say thank you to John and Steve. This has been a very meaty discussion, and I know our next program is of the Newark History Society is on Tuesday, March 14th, when I will speak on go back 250 years from this period to true owners of the land, Muncie, Lenape, and the first settlers of Newark. Then in April, Helen Paxton is here, is organizing a program marking the centenary of the New Jersey Symphony and going back to the roots of German-led musical groups and such in that period. And then toward the end of May, Larry Green of Seton Hall will be exploring the Black experience in World War II. So we're bouncing around in terms of time, but continuing to dig into the remarkable history of Newark. Thank you for coming, and hope to see you soon.